Good morning. How are you, Marty?
How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Yes.
It was a long day yesterday. How are you?
And I think it's going to get longer.
I know.
Good morning, everyone. Can we determine a quorum? All present?
That's right.
All present. Let's call the meeting to order. Thank you very much. Can I have a motion to adopt today's agenda?
So move.
Thank you. Move second.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Our agenda is adopted. Next item on the agenda is public comments. Welcome, public. Thank you for being here.
Madam Chair, we do have a public comment.
Thank you. Who has signed up?
Dr. Stephen DiGiuliano?
Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
Thank you for that extra syllable in my name. I'm Steve DiGiulio. I teach in the teacher education program, the alternative licensure for New Mexico teachers here at the college. As events on the national stage are reminding us all too forcefully, and the psychology of abuse has been telling us for a long time, victims have a lot of difficulty standing up for their rights. The reason is very simple. The abuser lands the first blow, and the victim is behind the eight ball from the beginning. I'd like to remind the board of what the college's agent told us in one of the very first labor board meetings. Mr. Mayer said, quote, "We don't have to agree to anything," end quote. When I heard that, I thought to myself, well, tough talk, you know, it's a tactic, somewhat juvenile of a tactic, to be sure. But I didn't really imagine that the college would continue a strategy of punishment and intimidation of the faculty and refuse to negotiate in good faith, notably withholding our state-mandated raise of 3%. Everyone in this room owes a debt that they cannot repay to educational institutions that have given them access to teachers who have helped them to understand themselves and this crazy world. Teachers who have helped them acquire the skills and knowledge which have gotten them where they are today. This is not a monetary transaction. And everyone in this room also knows that no teacher remains in the profession because they find it easy or lucrative. I think one of the problems is a misunderstanding of a basic concept of the way colleges are run, and that's shared governance. Shared governance does not mean that the faculty is trying to stage a coup and take over the college. Absolutely not. We don't want those jobs. We want and we need good management. Shared governance means that in the programs that we run, in our areas of expertise, the programs where we carry out the mission of the institution, that we have some real say in how they are run. I never imagined that the college would write their own contract, more appropriate for grounds workers and cafeteria workers than highly qualified professional faculty, and try to force it on us. I don't know what at this point we can do to move on. But even though the college does not have to agree to anything, we know there's a mechanism that comes into play. 2 days ago, this room was filled with students, faculty, family, community members, and a dozen people spoke movingly, forcefully, in support of the union, in support of their teachers, in support of the mission of this institution. I don't see how the college can attract a president who will take the job for the right reasons without settling the labor dispute. Of course, we can go to mediation and binding arbitration if that's the only way. But I will just submit that nobody comes away a winner if that happens. What we need is good faith negotiations between and among all of us day to day, not just at the negotiating table. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments, and we are looking forward to today's update on collective bargaining. Thank you. Are there any other public comments? Thank you. Okay, and that brings us to today's update on negotiations, please. Good morning. Who would like to begin?
If I could, Madam Chair, I'll go ahead and begin. I don't have much to say. If you have questions, obviously I'll stand for those. Thank you, board members, for the opportunity. Our update for today on September 12th of 2018, the college presented the union with a last best offer. We've been negotiating for over 10 months. As was noted, the increases that were approved by the governing board of the college we have not been able to grant those, given that we're still in collective bargaining negotiations. When we declared the impasse on September 12th by providing a last best offer, I mentioned at the table that I would contact the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service to seek mediation within the rules provided in this board's resolution. And the reason that we decided to go to the FMCS is because that agency is required to provide a mediator at no cost to the parties. The longtime mediator, David Martinez, who served here in New Mexico, I know Mr. Chua, you're aware of Mr. Martinez, retired effective September 16th. And so we've had some folks from the regional office look for mediators that are available out of the Phoenix area and some of the other southwestern states. As many of you may know, the federal fiscal year ends September 30th. And so there's been some difficulty getting that scheduled, the mediation scheduled. Mr. Teal, who's the commissioner out of Arizona, Phoenix, who responded, has some availability at the end of October. The union has stated they're not available during the times that he's available. And so I've contacted the regional office again. Of course, all these communications have been copied to Mr. Trujillo as the union's lead negotiator. We are trying to get something from one of the other mediators to come in and help us with the mediation. The resolution also requires that there's a 30-day mediation period at the end of which the parties can seek to go to arbitration. That is something that is on the table. Although we would like to mediate, Mr. Trujillo's expressed in his communications to me that he believes mediation could be helpful. We believe that it could be helpful as well, and so that's the path we're trying to take. If we can get a mediator scheduled within that time frame, obviously we'd be willing to waive any 30-day requirement under the resolution to seek arbitration, if we can get something scheduled. The other thing we haven't done as together is look for a mediator that's not from the FMCS. Part of that was as a cost savings for the parties, because both parties would then have to cover half the cost of that mediation if we had a private mediator come in. So at this point, we have not received from the SFCC AAUP a response to our last message than a request to go back to the table. We have presented our last best offer, and we are, from our point of view, at an impasse in negotiations. But we are working toward getting that mediation scheduled. We think it could be helpful, and that's my update. If you have questions, I'll answer them.
One question, you mentioned that the union has requested to go back to the table, and your response to that has been?
That we provided a last best offer, and we believe we're at an impasse. That's why we provided a last best offer.
Okay.
And we think mediation is the next step under the resolution and state law, and that's what we're proceeding to get to.
And is there any waiver of your declaration of impasse should you go back to the table?
Would there be a waiver? We believe there is a waiver if we go back to the table. There's
Then you're-
already provided a last best offer. Yes, ma'am.
Questions?
I'll wait till we hear the other side, then I'll.
Any questions?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here this morning. I guess we would say that we agree. They have submitted their last and final offer on September the 12th, just as Mr. Muir says. We have stated both in person and in writing that we actually don't feel like we are at impasse. But you know what they say about horses and water. But we would like to continue to negotiate. We feel as though we have room to move still. As you can remember, we went for a while where the college wanted a complete set of articles from us. We submitted those back in July. And at this point, there are many articles that we still feel like we can get close on. I believe my team says there's about 9 that we're exceedingly close on. And so even if we did proceed to arbitration, to us it makes more sense to have more mutually negotiated articles, and so that we can narrow it down to just a few. We actually, at the table, when we received the last best offer, suggested both in person and then followed up in writing, going to mediation in order to avoid the impasse procedure altogether. So a mediation not as part of the impasse procedure, but a mediation to avoid impasse totally. The college's team was not interested in that. Let's see. We wish to avoid impasse once again. Let me see if there's any other notes here I have. The last best offer included some addendums. We'd never seen them before, and which, that's fine. But we have formed questions about some of what's both in the last and final offer. There's logistical questions, there's things that we need clarified. And in the addendums, we noted that there are some changes that we would like to discuss, changes to status quo. And so we asked the team to come back to the table and at least discuss our questions with us. The college saw no reason to. My understanding is that they feel as though their last and final offer speaks for itself. So, let's see. I think that's all I have at this time, and I'm going to turn it over to Jerry. And actually, one of our other negotiators had a couple comments he was hoping to add to Jerry's. So I'm going to back up, unless you have questions about anything I have said.
Let's hold until we hear from everyone. Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. Yes, September 12th was our last negotiation session. It was SFCC presented their last best offer, which they advised if they were not willing to return to the table after that, that they would be at impasse. Since our last meeting that we've met with the Labor Board since August 10th, we've met 3 more times. We met August 24th, August 29th, and the September 12th meeting that we're addressing today. The August 24th meeting, we TA'd off on an article. And on August 29th, we submitted 9 more articles that were very close to agreement. We didn't receive a response for those 9 articles. We were met September 12th, to our surprise, with the last best offer. We indicated in the meetings prior that we wish to negotiate at the table. All of AAUP's articles were on the table. SFCC in the past had advised that they could not negotiate certain articles because they had not seen all of our articles. So since July 17th, they've had all of our articles. And being so close in the progress that we were making, seemed like we were closing this gap in our differences that we may have had. We were certainly willing to work them out. AAUP has taken the advice of the Labor Board. We've submitted agendas. We've grouped our articles together. We've collaborated with SFCC for interest-based bargaining, and we continue to do so. AAUP does not feel that we are at an impasse. That's the AAUP position, because there is still flexibility in the articles. And if we go back to the September 12th meeting with last best offer, we saw some new addendums that were attached. SFCC advised that they exist, that we know about them. They may exist in policy, and they may exist on campus somewhere. This is some common knowledge we do have, but there were changes in language to some of these addendums. We haven't had a chance to negotiate these. We haven't had a chance to discuss the language. So we requested on September 21st, which was last Friday, in writing that we return to the table we may have some questions. We may look at other alternatives. We had made it clear that our position is to go to mediation, and we encourage mediation to avoid impasse. So some of the concerns we have are SFCC basically has unilaterally declared an impasse. But yet, it seems like we were making progress since we signed off on August 24th. We had 9 more articles that were close. So this is a bit confusing to us on why this turn of events and this turn of progress. SFCC simply cited philosophical differences, dated back to December 7th when we couldn't agree on ground rules. But when we asked to identify what philosophical differences we were talking about, there was not any identification of such. Simply a blanket term that said, well, we've had these differences since December 7th, and we've talked about them at the table. Now, whether they're philosophical or not, I guess that's meant to be debated. Obviously, there are some differences, but we've been making progress to close this gap. So at this point, SFCC has contacted a mediator to schedule mediation under the impression that we're at impasse. So I guess we have a disagreement whether we're at impasse or not. SFCC's position is that we are not, and we're trying to avoid this. We understand the law, that we can go to mediation, it is an option. We can go to arbitration, that is an option. But what about the collaborative? What about our campus? 2 days ago, as mentioned previously, this room was filled with people that support bargaining in the city of Santa Fe and for SFCC. So we continue to strive for that vision, for that process, and for that collaborative. Our message is simple. Let's go to the table and communicate. Let's bargain. July 17th is when we submitted all of our proposals. Since then, we've met 4 times. Hardly enough to do some real bargaining at the table, where we can look at all the articles and bargain, not just a set of articles or a group of articles, but all the articles. Because this was SFCC's claim from the beginning. We don't have all your articles, so we can't bargain certain articles. We can only bargain a few articles. So we did, and we made some progress. We TA'd off on some of those few articles. So our position is that we continue to negotiate at the table and have an opportunity to address all of our articles, not in some short meetings, not in just 4 meetings, whereas one of them was just a last best offer meeting, so basically 3 meetings, but to continue forward with the process, with real negotiation at the table. And that's kind of where we're at right now. AAUP, we're determining what the next best step will be, and we are trying to get back to the table. Impasse is not just because someone decides not to negotiate anymore. That's not the definition of impasse in any labor forum that I've had experience with. Just because you do not want to bargain does not mean you're at impasse. So that's the news. It's not good news, but it's news as to this date on where we are at with SFCC and the AAUP.
Thank you. Further comments?
Yeah, I think, given what Jerry has said, I think if I can reflect a little bit on the process over these last 10 months, it might shed a bit of light on this. You know, it's often good to step back and reflect, and we've had some time to do that. And I've been thinking about what has gone on over these last 10 months. And what I would say is and I realize that Mr. Mayor would categorize this differently. I would not characterize what we've experienced as good faith bargaining overall, but rather lots of posturing, lots of positioning. While it's true that neither side is obligated to move towards the other, we understand that. In reality, most of the movement we've seen on the part of SFCC has been on more permissive issues, less critical issues, where certainly we have made some progress. And to be fair, there have been a few sessions. It seemed like we were making more progress on more critical issues. But in the end, again, as I reflect back, I see that very little progress, very little movement was made on very important key issues like workload, like compensation, like educational benefits, and those sorts of things. And certainly when you look at the very few articles that we TA'd on, they are in fact very much boilerplate, except for one, perhaps. I mean, when I consider, you know, the real nature of bargaining and negotiation, the sense of at some point getting to where we say, okay, well, I'll tell you what, we're willing to give up on this or to move a bit on this if you're willing to move on that. Those sorts of discussion, that kind of language never ever took place at the table. We never got to do that. So reluctantly, I mean, our impression is that there might never have been, this is our impression, a real desire to bargain in good faith over these last 10 months. I find it odd, again, as I think back, that way back in February, I think the word impasse was dropped a couple times at the table. And I remember thinking, well, that's odd. Why would the word impasse be dropped at the table 2 months in? As if somehow things were being shaped to go in that direction. You know, as far as 10 months, I realize that 10 months can seem like a long time, but in reality, from everything that we know and from the AUP database and from our own council, typically first-year contracts, faculty contracts, can take a year and a half. So, you know, 10 months isn't really considering that long. So that's our perception of things. And it's really disappointing that at this point, SFCC has decided to stop negotiating when, in essence, from our perspective, we didn't do a heck of a lot of that.
Thank you.
I'd just like to start with a couple of responses to some of those things, just from our perspective. Obviously, we disagree that there was not bargaining at the table. Specifically, an article that was addressed in terms of if you move on this, we'll move on that. There has been specific articles that were championed by the individual, and this gentleman sitting to my left here, that we did make those movements and have a lot of discussion on those points. Our response to whether we're at an impasse can be unilaterally declared. We have provided our last best offer. An impasse is not, we didn't just simply decide to stop bargaining. We've reviewed the contract that we have made as a proposal, and it is as far as we can go. That is the definition of what a last best offer is. Those have to do with economic issues outside of economics. There are some things in the contract that we disagree with. Mr. Trujillo talked about being very close on a lot of articles. We could be very close on a lot of those articles. We have not come to an agreement on those articles. That does not stop one of the parties from declaring an impasse and providing a last best offer. Before that, the September 12th meeting, Mr. Trujillo and I did have some sidebars, and I explained to him we were headed in that direction. Obviously, his understanding of those meetings is different than mine, but that's where we headed. As to the addendums to the contract, the language that stated those would be included was always included in our proposals. There was always an understanding those would be included. The only changes to the language in the addendums were to make match to the proposals in our articles. In other words, the addendums that describe the duties and responsibilities of chairs. We made some proposals in the workload section that affected what that spreadsheet would look like. And so those changes were made to reflect our proposals in the contract. Those were discussed at the table. Those were discussed. We had whole sessions where Margaret and the union talked about specific faculty issues around workload, around those articles. During collective bargaining, there was a question about the contracts that individuals were signing for this year. We sent copies of the contracts as they are attached to the addendum now to the union management committee, not just through negotiations, but Ms. Iannarino actually reviewed those. We talked about why they didn't feel those were status quo. There was discussion as to the changes we made in the contracts themselves were just formatting language and contracts that would make them match the other faculty contracts, and to make sure that based on the definition of probationary that the state board gave us for employees here, that those contract language matched what was negotiated at the table. So the claim from our perspective that none of those issues were from our perspective, that is not the case. We discussed all of those things, and the only reason the language in the addendums changed was to make sure it matched what we had included in our proposals. And as you remember, our proposals were provided in a full package in December of 2017. We've been negotiating there from. Mr. Trujillo also represented that they've taken the board's advice by taking steps to incorporate what you've recommended as a board towards their negotiations. They have when it suits them. For instance, you said in April of this year, it does make sense for you to give a full package proposal so that you can have full negotiations on these issues. We didn't get that until July 17th, as Mr. Trujillo stated. So characterizing their compliance with your recommendations as a whole, I think is a little bit disingenuous. We have not resisted those. The idea of interest-based bargaining is not something that was presented at the beginning of negotiations, and we talk about that at the table. We did. It's not something that we believe the negotiations supported at this point, given the fact that we had already exchanged written proposals back and forth, and that's what is required by the resolution in state law. The other thing I'd like to state is bargaining in good faith shall not require either party to agree to a proposal or make a concession. That's actually what I stated at the beginning, months ago. And I stated that to set the stage for that negotiations are going to be tough. But it doesn't mean that we're bargaining in bad faith just because we don't agree with language that has been proposed on the other side of the table. In terms of stating that they can move further, we'd encourage them to make that movement in a written proposal and provide that to us so that we can get to a mediation and hopefully resolve the impasse. Thank you.
Before we have questions and comments from the board, anything else? Okay. Colleagues? Questions, comments?
Just a question. You mentioned the 9 articles are not complete. Just give me a frame of reference here. How complete are you in this process after 10 months? 20%, 30%, 70%, 80%? Excuse me?
What do you mean by not complete?
Well, where you have some agreement. You have some agreement that both sides agree. You wouldn't have to go beyond that. What percent is that of the total contract as you are working through this process? What are you at 50%?
We've actually TA'd off on 5 articles, and there's another 9 articles that are very close to TA.
So you're
Yes,
And they're 39.
total articles are.
so you're not halfway there. So conceivably, you could be on the 1.5 or beyond the normal what you just stated, that year and a half, maybe 2 years or not. It could be shorter than that. But my concern is that this is a learning process, I'm sure, for the college, for both sides. In that process, you move and you move forward, move back in that engagement. But this doesn't surprise me. It happens a lot in the initial stages of contracts. I just hope you can get to that next stage without too much acrimony, that we'll get into a situation that will spill over into the nature of the community and the students and the welfare of the college.
I have a couple questions. Thank you all for the presentations. So I hear loud and clear that there's a difference between the college feeling that they're at an impasse, the union feeling we're not quite at an impasse and you want to keep working. Mr. Muir, can you talk about why, in your view, you're at an impasse versus this idea that maybe this sort of pre-impasse mediation isn't a good idea, and then maybe speak to what you would hope to get through the mediation process that you're kind of looking to schedule now versus the union's idea to do the pre-mediation. In other words, what's your view that we had to do the mediation in the impasse arena versus outside, just so I can get an understanding of that?
Yes, sir. So the reason that, well, first of all, the first question, you asked me a bunch of questions there. So
Yeah, I
wanna
apologize.
clarify what I'm going to answer.
Yeah.
The first question, I think, is why Santa Fe Community College has declared impasse. We have done that because under the law, what that means, and I'm not trying to sound like I'm educating. I know a lot of this is understood, but under the resolution, once you have bargained to a point where your bargaining team and your constituency feels there's no more movement, you declare an impasse. You provide a last best offer. There is nothing in the resolution that requires pre-impasse mediation. The reason that the mediation is built in after you reach the last best offer is to really get the parties to a point where, hey, let's talk about what really is at issue here. Because we're talking about philosophical differences that we believe have extended through. And whether or not there's an agreement that those differences exist, looking at the proposal and language there are philosophical differences on many issues. And so the resolution contemplates, and the state law contemplates, getting to a point where you're not going to make movement further, even if you're close on some articles. Impasse happens all the time when that occurs. We have TA'd on 4 to 5 articles, as Mr. Trujillo stated. The idea of getting to our last best offer and going to mediation after that is to narrow the issues, to get us to a point where we're talking about here are the real issues, and that's why we provided our last best offer. The union has not done that. And so we can't get to that mediation to talk about that and potentially make some movement on those things if we can in that mediation. So from our perspective, whether one feels that there's an impasse or not is not at issue. We have provided a last best offer. The resolution and state law state that once you reach an impasse, that is the procedures that you go through. One of the things we'd be willing to do is go to a mediator that is not with the FMCS given their schedule. Again, the problem with that is the cost to the parties. That's one of the things that when the resolution and the state law were reestablished in 2003, was contemplated to make sure that, that didn't cost the parties, right? And FMCS used to have 2 mediators here in New Mexico for that purpose. That's something we'd be willing to explore. Our position is we are at impasse, and we're not interested in going back to the table to discuss things that we feel we've talked about over and over for 10 months. And so that's where we sit. In terms of getting to impasse mediation, again, I stated the reasons and the philosophy behind why that occurs after impasse is to show that is our last best offer, here's the other parties. If there can be movement between those, that's what we're asking the mediator to help with. And so from our perspective, we have provided an offer from which we can't move at this point. We feel we've moved as far as we can. We feel we have discussed these issues to the point where we've made this movement. There has been some struggle between the package proposals on the table, which we received, provided ours in December, and we've talked about this. The structure and some of the language, they just don't match up, so it makes it a little hard, but we feel that we've explained where we've moved on those to the union and have provided that last best offer. So we are willing to mediate, and we would like to get to the mediation and discuss where and if we can move any further off our last best offer.
And the folks from the union want to just try to maybe respond to that, just now that you've heard kind of where they are, if you have a response at all, maybe it's helpful.
All right, thank you. So yes, the process is negotiating at the table. And, you know, as we explained, as we've had our negotiation sessions, there has been progress. Yes, it's been tiring. Yes, we've discussed issues repeatedly. And yes, we've continued to discuss new issues as well. That's part of negotiation. Just because you get tired of negotiating doesn't mean you can stop negotiations. You're still mandated to negotiate at the table. And this is the position of AAUP, is we feel there's still flexibility in articles based on discussions at the table as well. And I know, you know, SFCC, they go into to caucus, and they do come back with questions, and sometimes there is movement. But it's very puzzling, given this dynamic, how we go through this process of December 7th, which by the way was for ground rules. It was to establish ground rules. That's basically what our agenda was. It wasn't to submit a completed CBA at that point. So, but given that, you know, that's how it started, and we've been trying to build the trust to move forward with negotiations. And as we continue, you know, after July 17th, when they've received all of our articles, and then we TA off on an article, and then we're close to 9 more articles, all of a sudden this negotiation has accelerated. And then you come to the next meeting, and it's at a stop because it's our last best offer, and they're not willing to negotiate, or they feel they can't move anymore. It's just a reverse direction than where we're headed at the table. And we discussed at the table, let's sit down and let's compare some article. Let's do some horse trading, if you will, since we have all of our articles on the table now. So because of this, and then the new addendums as well, there were changes in language. In fact, one of the addendums was signed the day of the negotiation session, dated the same day of our negotiation of September 12th. So if it's dated the same day of the negotiation, and that's the first time we see it, how could we possibly reviewed it? So there's this change in dynamic at the table. And we thought, again, things were moving forward. We thought we were closing this gap. Geez, we had 9 more that were close, very close, that AAUP had flexibility with, that we told them. There were probably more articles that we could get, that we felt we were coming close on, that we could still negotiate at the table. Now, all of a sudden, we're at a standstill. So we feel, AAUP's position, we don't feel like that's our last best offer. We don't feel like this negotiation should be over because we were accelerating the process, because we could see some of the agreements we have and whether they're philosophical, and still we weren't going to debate that at the table and use our time to debate philosophical difference. We just simply asked, well, what are they? Maybe we could, our intention was, well, let's work on our philosophical differences on our part and see how much closer we could get, but we didn't get that opportunity. So I guess there's confusion as to our progress. And simply, I guess, I don't know if, I know it's cumbersome and tiresome, and I know it is a new process for many of us. It's a learning process. We're learning from each other. It's a different dynamic on campus, a different philosophy, a different way of thinking, because there is a union on campus now. There's faculty voice that's heard and to be included in process. And it's a shift, and we understand that, and that's why we'd like to continue negotiating at the table because of all these things. Yes, because it is new, because it is a new process, and because it's a new way of thinking. And we don't want to be shortchanged from invoking that process. And we understand what the dynamics of labor are. And that's why we're saying we don't feel we're at impasse. We still have that flexibility. And if we go to mediation, let's go to avoid this impasse. Let's work together. Let's collaborate. We're on the same campus. It's not an us against them type situation. And that's not our message we want to send. We want to say we're here to work together. We're here to be helpful. We're here to grow this campus. We're here to grow the community. And that's our positioning for this mediation, and that's why we're trying to avoid an impasse, and that's why we'd like to go to a mediator to see where our philosophical differences are, to help identify those and see how much closer we can get on articles. We have 9 of them, which is a good start for any mediator to look at.
I just want to address one comment that was made. The addendum that was provided, that was signed that day, is the salary schedule that has been in place at the college for years. It was signed that day because it has not been changed or updated from the year before. We wanted to provide a current so that everyone understood what that was. So the numbers have not changed. It's the same salary schedule.
Well, since you brought it up, the numbers have not changed, that's correct, but some of the language has changed as far as the practices that go with that schedule. And so understandings that we have now about, about step raises and when you get them and when you don't, some of the language has been removed. And so, we had questions about it. That's all I'll say. Yeah.
And I'll
Unless
just,
you wanna
I would,
clarify.
like, the reason some of that language has been removed is because we're in a different process. We're in negotiations with the union. So the language that said things that could be unilaterally implemented has been removed.
So are you saying that it is the union's belief that the individual employee contracts are not maintaining status quo?
Will you ask that one more time?
Is it the union's belief that the individual employee contracts do not maintain status quo?
Well, actually, a concern has been raised. Yeah, and we haven't communicated our concerns yet because we were unclear about what we wanted to do next about it. So, but since you're asking such a direct question, I would say that there is a perspective that there are practices that are status quo based on the signed 1718 salary schedule thing. It outlines a practice, and the practice wasn't followed the way that it says in that piece of writing. So
then you're evaluating the status quo obligation, essentially.
Yeah, and so when it is, as Mr. Muir said, when it came time to sign our contracts like we always do, they were really good about letting us review the templates and everything. But what we didn't review, or what we didn't review were the amounts of salary. And so because, it was like an anonymous contract, it didn't have a name and an amount put in. We just saw the templates. But the current salary schedule has language in it about when you get steps and when you don't. It says something about, people will get, as status quo practice has been, a step raise unless there's been a declared financial emergency. And apparently, some of our members have not received step raises. And I can imagine that there's some confusion and maybe difference of interpretation about what status quo is, certainly. So it's...
I'm going to suggest, if I may interrupt, that this really isn't the time or place to argue that it was a query about, it sounds like that's something that is, that is being evaluated at this time. A couple of thoughts. I want to be clear, first of all, that this board has no authority to tell you what to do. We've said that before, and it bears repeating now. I'm going to agree. I would agree that going back and negotiating, continuing negotiations in the same way that you have been negotiating is unlikely to yield any kind of different results. I'm going to make a perhaps a radical suggestion, and that is setting aside whether you are or are not at impasse, setting aside how to implement mediation, because it sounds as though there is a desire to have a mediator in one way or another. I'm going to ask you to consider something a little bit different, and that is not to negotiate, but to sit down with each other and have a conversation. Talk, have a cup of coffee, talk with each other about some of the, where do you see the biggest philosophical gaps that you think you are never going to bridge? Why? Just talk with each other. That would be a thought, whether you choose to do that or not do that. I'm concerned about the impact on ongoing relationships. Our first speaker was quite right when he said that good faith doesn't just happen at the negotiating table. It happens every day in how labor and management communicate with each other, dialogue with each other, and in the best possible world, collaborate with each other. I'm going to suggest that you consider whether you have, in fact, bargained to impasse. And there is that expectation when impasse is achieved that you have bargained to impasse. So, a little soul searching perhaps for each team. And if you choose, put the papers away, put the articles away, put the TAs away, and get to know each other, get to know what management needs, what is their bottom line need, what is the bottom line need of the professional employees that the union represents. Anything else?
Can I just add a thought to that? You've chosen a model of how to deal with collective bargaining, which is the traditional model. And I think what you're advocating is a variation of that theme. It would seem to me that AAUP, that might mean an adjustment for the approach to bargaining, which has a certain protocol on how you approach that. It may mean to the management as well that perhaps we have a certain aspect that we want to follow, i.e. that traditional model. Should you shift from that, that will require a lot of agreement without that spilling over into the traditional language you put into a contract. How you do that can be very delicate. I understand what you're advocating there, but you have to build a reservoir of trust to be able to do that, to where you come back to the table that same degree of trust holds at the table. If not, it's going to go all over the place. Trust me. I've been there with this one. A good approach, but just make sure that you have some sense of understanding that you're not going to go back to your group and reverse the direction on the basis of what you had already had some agreement on, outside of what you're doing in the actual bargaining process. Does that make sense to you? It's just a caution.
Thank you for that.
Madam Chair,
Please.
may I make one last comment?
Please.
Thank you for the suggestions. We understand, from our perspective, we understand both Dr. Gonzalez's suggestion and yours, Madam Chair. one thing I wanted to mention is, and get on the record, we're talking about building trust and cooperation. One of those instances was us providing to the union the contracts for this year to maintain the status quo, to review those to make sure, and there were a couple of errors, we corrected those, we put those in place. There was no provision for the union to have a voice in the selection of the new incoming president. When we found that out, we remedied that and allowed and asked the search committee who's been hired to do that and who runs the agenda to allow the union to have that opportunity. So I think we're moving in those directions. And I just wanted to have that on record, because outside of the bargaining table, it is a traditional bargaining, it is a traditional bargaining construct that's contemplated both by state law and by the resolution that we're operating. And so that's how we've approached it. But there are those things happening outside of the collective bargaining table that management is working through the process. It is a learning process, but we are trying to make sure there is cooperation on important issues outside of this. I just wanted to make sure that when we're talking about what's happening just at the collective bargaining table, there are some other things that have occurred between the parties that I think have started to build some of that trust.
Thank you for sharing that, and I don't think any of us have any doubt that the capacity for collaboration does exist, and thank you for sharing these examples of how you're pursuing a collaborative relationship.
No, and I'll just, for the record, recognize that things are true. And so they have been good about certain, we've asked and it happened. And so it's good. It's just, there's also some work to do.
Which is a good starting place for mediation, frankly. And a mediator would come in and, start by focusing on your strengths to spread those out into, to generalize that into perhaps a different way of relating to each other at the bargaining table. It sounds like you certainly have the capacity to do that.
I just want to piggyback on that. I mean, I think I really appreciate what both of you sort of offered. From our perspective, at least from my perspective, sitting up here, what I hear is there are certainly substantive differences, and there are always going to be, and you're working through those. There's this little trust gap that we also kind of see every time you're up here, and that also, I guess, we can expect that. This is kind of where you guys are. In the context of mediation or arbitration or even in negotiations, the trust gap will keep it from ever. You'll never meet if we're too far away on trust. You go into mediation, it's never going to work. So I think that the sort of out of the box suggestion of just sitting down or even more talk about, here's why I think we're at an impasse. We're tired of talking about these things because that's why we think we're at an impasse. Here's why we think we're not at an impasse. Here's why we as a union think there should be some movement. I think that gets you kind of closer together, and that's what I think we hope you see, that maybe that helps. So I just kind of wanted to echo that. I think that may be a good way to approach it for sure.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And actually, you might want to stay seated where you are so we can move to our action item, board action on joint motion to vacate the hearing that was anticipated for today due to a compromise. And my understanding, help us out with this, please, Mr. Kennedy. My understanding is that we might want to see a joint dismissal order. Is that correct?
Well, the parties have, Madam Chair and members of the board, the parties have submitted a joint motion to vacate the hearing because they've compromised the underlying issues. Naturally, keeping it open from your perspective doesn't make sense if there's been a compromise. So I think it's for the board to inquire of the parties if they intend this thing to be dismissed or not.
Okay. Would you like to respond?
Do you have a response? Okay.
I mean,
Sir, Madam Chair, myself and counsel for the AAUP, James Montalbano, we did discuss the compromise. we agreed to an approach and to provide this joint motion to vacate the hearing. In other words, just the parties have come to the compromise and don't feel that any hearing is necessary. We did not submit an order because we just assumed if you accepted our motion, the hearing would be completed and there would be no need for a hearing going forward. So in our motion, we asked that the underlying issues involved in those particular PPC, that particular PPC and the cross complaint be dismissed with prejudice. Going forward, any of the facts or complaints raised in those, we'd ask that they be dismissed. Again, just on the facts that were presented to the board.
So we are hearing a request for a motion of dismissal.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
That's added language, yeah,
Okay.
okay. Good.
Members? Questions?
I would move we accept the motion to vacate with dismissal as presented.
Yeah, I'd second that, yeah. I mean, it sounds like what we're doing is we're dismissing with prejudice the motion and the cross motion, which we can do here today.
And if I may clarify, in paragraph 6 of our motion, 7, excuse me, we have reached a compromise and the parties have agreed to withdraw their complaints. So I mean, I think what we're doing is asking the board to dismiss the complaint because we've withdrawn.
Okay.
Madam Chair, effectively what they're saying is your file is going to be closed.
Yes.
Exactly, okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Vacated, dismissed, and closed. Right? Okay, I think we've covered it.
Good.
All right, thank you. Next action item is approval of August 10th meeting minutes. Has everybody had an opportunity? Do we need another moment to review the minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes from August 10th.
Madam Chair, may I make a suggestion? I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No, not
Justin.
at
On page 4 of the minutes, there are a couple of places where the term interest-based bargaining is actually called interspace bargaining.
Did not pick that up.
Interspace.
Thank you. Could you
And-
point that out for us?
Maybe it is interspace, but perhaps that could be clarified wherever it appears in the minutes. It's toward the bottom of the page, 2/3 in Marlene's comment and also Marcy's comment. It's interspace rather than interest-based, and I might suggest that be modified.
With that modification, can we approve the minutes? I think that's a good suggestion.
I'm sorry for the interruption.
Not at all. So we'll move to approve with that change made throughout.
And with thanks for picking that up by a thorough reading of the minutes. Thank you so much. With that change, we have a motion. Do we have a second to approve the minutes with change? And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Although this does lead to some interesting possibilities, doesn't it? Okay. Not on our agenda, but I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Patricia as our, your official role with our group is, you're our everything, so. Okay. Thank you so much. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank Donna Wells for her service to this board as well. Next action item is approval of appointment of vice chair. First, we need to nominate a vice chair. So I'd like to make that distinction. Do we have any nominations for vice chair? That position was vacated by the resignation of Vince Yermal from our board. Nominations? I would like to nominate Justin Kaufman for vice chair. Second?
Second, excuse me.
That's okay.
I was writing the name down.
1 second myself.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Shall we set our next meeting date before we adjourn?
Madam Chair, I think I sent a note out that I have conflicts in October and December, committed travel that I don't want to change my tickets. And if you would permit, I would suggest some different dates.
Don't blame me for a minute, and I'm sure we all have commitments on various dates. So the second week of October is coming up rather quickly anyway, and I'm not going to be available on the 14th either. Do we want to aim for another day in October?
I would,
Sorry, that would be the 12th would be the second, wouldn't it?
I'd like to suggest 26th is,
Would you be available then?
The 26th, I think I can't do the 26th. I was going to suggest, if it's not too far out, either the November 2nd or the November 9th Friday. Would either one of those work? I thought, Tom, you said October wasn't good, so I was already looking at November, but.
well, I can meet after the 18th, but up until that time,
Yeah,
I'm committed.
Any possibility of meeting on the 19th? Considering what's happening now, I'm a little reluctant to
yeah,
go out too far.
What date were you saying?
October 19th.
Possibly the 19th?
I'm out of state.
That's going to be real tough for me.
Mhm.
That day for the college's professional development day, so maybe
Mm.
Okay.
I wonder, is there a day other than Friday the following week that
That's
we
fine
might be
with-
available?
That's fine with me.
The week of the 22nd?
Yeah.
The 25th, the Thursday, would that work?
It's fine with me.
I honestly don't know yet,
Okay.
but are you good on that day, the 25th?
25th is okay.
Okay, I should know by early next week.
Yep.
Do we want to say tentatively Thursday, the 25th?
It's
And
fine.
then we'll just communicate with each other.
Okay.
Okay. Please, if possible.
9 o'clock?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we can give that a try. I think in the past,
It looks like there's an event scheduled in the boardroom on the 25th at 10 o'clock.
is there an alternate location?
I don't, will they be able to record in there, though? Oh, okay. Yes. Let me check that one.
Okay, thank you. Any other business? And can I hear a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. We are adjourned. Thank you, Jerry. Good. I'll answer. Good luck to you guys. Yeah, good luck.
Well, thank you all. I have to run. I thought this was 9 a.m., so I scheduled at 11:30. I was in the cafeteria. I felt like a student. It was great.
That's always good.
But, yeah, just getting work done.
So was this a surprise to you?
A little bit.
Me too. To you? MCAS was a surprise.
Right.
There's no
Right.
fault. There's no harm.
No. And he's here in Santa Fe? Douglas Brenner.
Is he and he's a labor mediator as well?
I don't know how much I was just working with him.
Okay.
Certainly it's something somebody can ask him. 'Cause
Yeah.
He's here and he's probably gonna have it.
Yeah.
So,
Be excellent idea. We get beyond the, is it impasse or not impasse? They gotta get beyond that. Otherwise, you're gonna get stuck.
that's what
Right.
I understand. That's the problem. It's kind of what goes on to this.
Right.
Whether it's before or after.
But there are differences, I'm not remembering specifically, are there differences in the status quo obligation after impasse than before in either? One or the other.
Right.
There's no last best offer.
Well, and that's the first comment was prescient. He said, no one's gonna be happy when we get to that, so let's just try to do whatever we can before that.
For a relationship, it
No,
stinks.
you don't wanna
It's
have
like
it,
the worst
some
possible.
baby split on arbitration.
Do it in your
But it's
eighth
not even
country.
split.
No, it's not.
You know,
It's
it's
whatever
like
it is.
yours or yours.
Right, right.
My observation. But I've spent a number of years on the inside of these guys. I've just seen symptoms of carryover stuff that it's been just dumped on them. So we're trying to get all that out of this process, and it's tough for them. And then
Shifting relationship.
it's tough. It's tough for them.
That's why I think that comment about trust that you made was really, because they, I mean, we saw when this started, they didn't trust each other at anything. And so they're trying, and I think as they meet, they get better. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Over whether or not it is or isn't, but
just at least get it together. And I think he'd be open to
The
it
other
because
thing
he
that
wants to.
could occur, and just who knows who the new president will be, he or she, depending upon their style, can help turn this in a different direction.
Right.
And that will have a lot to do with the future, how they do this.
I was hoping that might happen in the interim.
Yes,
But
just
not
to,
so.
all right, I'm gonna break up the quorum.
Take care.
There you go. See you.
Bye, Justin. Take care.
Thank you.
Until next time. Thank you, John. Tricia, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was nice to meet everybody.
Good to meet you too. Welcome. Have you been with the college for a while, or is this new position and new to the college?
Yes, everything.
Wow.
I've been here a month.
Here at the college a
Yes.
month? How about in Sandton?
Oh, I was born and raised in San
Okay.
But my husband and I, we lived in Utah for about 18 years until
I'm doing some work in Utah, actually.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I do special ed mediation in Utah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yep.
Where's your friend?
Well, anywhere.
Oh, anywhere. Yeah, right now I'm actually Jordan.
Yeah, you know, Utah. I haven't been, I'm still looking for a road trip. So where are you from in Utah? Or where were you in Utah?
We were in southern Utah and then our, went back and forth to Park City to Cedar City, I think. Yeah, we drove a lot.
not, they're a little bit shorter, the meetings, so.
Yeah, these are definitely not like the regular board meetings.
So they said, the next meeting is probably gonna change, but they said it might be in the president's meeting. So can you guys prepare?
I think so, yes, because they just installed a new setup in there. And it has one of those units for streaming. So, I don't know, I think there's just one camera though, so it would just be like a wide shot. Just,
Okay.
it's same setup like